my God, help!
You won't believe what happened when a Mexican housekeeper saved a millionaire's mother from drowning in North Carolina. What she did next will shock you to your core, and the secret she'd been hiding for years will leave you speechless. This is the true story of how one moment of courage changed 2 lives forever, and why millions of people can't stop talking about what happened that day in Charlotte. Arnold Wellington III stood on the marble terrace of his $8 million mansion in Myers Park, Charlotte, adjusting his Rolex Submariner as he watched his Mexican housekeeper Ximena scrubbing the pool tiles on her hands and knees. At 45 years old, Arnold was everything you'd expect from old Carolina money combined with new tech fortune. His family had owned tobacco plantations for generations, and he'd multiplied that wealth tenfold through his software company that he'd sold to Microsoft for $200 million just 3 years earlier. Standing 6'2" with perfectly styled silver gray hair and wearing a custom Tom Ford suit even on this casual Saturday morning, Arnold looked like he'd stepped out of a Forbes magazine cover. But what nobody knew, not even Ximena, who had worked for him for 3 years, was that underneath all that arrogance and wealth, Arnold was desperately lonely and carrying a burden that was slowly destroying him from the inside. "Ximena," he called out in that dismissive tone that made service workers everywhere cringe. "When you're done with that, my mother's wheelchair needs to be moved to the garden. She wants to see her roses before the heat gets too unbearable." Just another face in the background of their privileged lives. "Of course, Mr. Wellington," she replied in accented English, though what Arnold didn't know was that her accent was carefully cultivated. The truth about Ximena Rodriguez was so shocking that when it finally came to light, it would shake the very foundations of everything Arnold believed about himself and the world around him. Arnold's mother, Eleanor Wellington, was 83 years old and had been in a wheelchair for the past 2 years after a stroke had left her partially paralyzed. The stroke had been devastating for Arnold, not just because he loved his mother, but because Eleanor was the only person in his life who had ever truly seen through his facade. She was the only one who knew about the panic attacks that started after his divorce 5 years ago. The only one who knew about the prescription medication he'd been secretly taking for anxiety. And the only one who knew that despite all his money and success, Arnold went to bed every night feeling completely alone in the world. What made his relationship with his mother even more complicated was that Eleanor had never approved of how Arnold treated their household staff. She'd grown up during the civil rights era and had always believed that respect and dignity should be given to every human being, regardless of their economic status. But Arnold, shaped by boarding schools and country clubs where entitlement was served with afternoon tea, had never learned that lesson. As Ximena moved toward the house to help with Eleanor's wheelchair, Arnold's phone buzzed with another text from his ex-wife demanding more alimony. Sarah had already taken half of everything in the divorce, including their house in the Hamptons and their share in the vineyard in Napa Valley, but she seemed determined to bleed him dry. The stress of the ongoing legal battles, combined with the pressure of managing his investments and dealing with his mother's declining health, had been taking its toll on Arnold for months. But he had no idea that in exactly 17 minutes, everything in his perfectly controlled world was about to fall apart, and the person who would save not just his mother's life, but ultimately his own soul, was the quiet woman he barely acknowledged as she scrubbed his floors and cleaned his toilets. Ximena wheeled Eleanor out to the garden, listening patiently as the elderly woman pointed out which roses were blooming and which ones needed more attention from the landscaper. Eleanor had always been kind to Ximena, unlike her son, and over the 3 years of working in the Wellington household, a genuine friendship had developed between the two women. Eleanor would often ask about Ximena's family, about her son Miguel, who was studying at North Carolina State University, and about the dreams she'd had to put on hold when she came to America 20 years ago. What Eleanor didn't know, what nobody in Charlotte's elite social circles could have imagined, was that Ximena had a PhD in biochemical engineering from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, one of the most prestigious universities in Latin America. She'd been on track to work for pharmaceutical companies, developing life-saving medications, when a family crisis had forced her to leave everything behind and come to North Carolina with nothing but hope and determination. Arnold was inside his home office, stressing over portfolio reports and trying to figure out why his investment advisor was recommending that he liquidate some of his tech stocks, when he heard a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was his mother's scream, high-pitched and full of terror, cutting through the morning air like a knife through silence. He dropped his papers and ran toward the sound, his dress shoes slipping on the marble floors as he rushed through the French doors onto the terrace. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Eleanor's wheelchair was rolling toward the deep end of the pool, having apparently gotten away from her somehow. She was gripping the armrests with her one good hand, her face white with panic as the wheelchair picked up speed on the slight incline of the pool deck. Arnold's mind went completely blank. For all his money, for all his business success, for all his Ivy League education, he was frozen in absolute terror as he watched his mother heading straight for 12 feet of water in a wheelchair she couldn't escape from. The distance was too far for him to run and catch her. The speed was too fast for him to somehow stop the wheelchair. Time seemed to slow down as he realized he was about to watch his mother die right in front of his eyes, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. But Ximena had been trained for emergencies in ways that Arnold could never have imagined. Without hesitation, without even thinking about her own safety, she dove into the pool fully clothed and swam with powerful, precise strokes toward the spot where the wheelchair was about to hit the water. Her movements were so fast and so confident that it was clear this wasn't the first time she'd responded to a life-threatening emergency. The wheelchair hit the water with Eleanor still in it and immediately began to sink. Eleanor's good hand clawed desperately at the water, but she couldn't swim, couldn't escape, couldn't do anything but panic as the water rose around her chest and then her neck. Arnold screamed his mother's name from the pool deck, but he still couldn't move, still couldn't think of anything to do except watch in horror. That's when Ximena reached them, moving with the skill and confidence of someone who had clearly had professional training. She dove down and began working to free Eleanor from the wheelchair's safety belt and arm restraints. The wheelchair had sunk to about 8 feet deep, and Eleanor was completely underwater, her silver hair floating around her face as she fought against unconsciousness. Arnold watched in amazement as Ximena freed his mother and brought her to the surface, keeping Eleanor's head above water while swimming toward the shallow end, with her in a perfect rescue hold. But Eleanor wasn't breathing. Her lips were blue, her eyes were closed, and she looked lifeless in Ximena's arms. Instead of panicking, Ximena carried Eleanor out of the pool with surprising strength and immediately began performing CPR with the precision and competence of a medical professional. Her compressions were perfectly timed, her rescue breaths were properly administered, and she worked with the calm confidence of someone who had done this many times before. "Call 911, Ximena shouted to Arnold, who was still standing frozen on the deck. "Now! Tell them we need an ambulance for a drowning victim who's unresponsive." "The ambulance is coming, but I think you're going to be okay." It wasn't subservience or deference. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had training, education, and experience that he couldn't even imagine. "I learned it in Mexico, Mr. Wellington," she said simply, but Arnold caught something in her tone that made him realize there was much more to this story. The paramedics arrived and took over Eleanor's care, pronouncing her stable, but recommending a trip to the hospital for observation. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Eleanor reached out and grabbed Ximena's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." There was no brain damage from oxygen deprivation, no water in her lungs, and no complications from the incident. As Arnold sat in the hospital waiting room, still in shock from what he'd witnessed, he kept replaying the scene in his mind. The way Ximena had moved through the water, the way she'd performed CPR, the way she'd taken charge of the entire emergency with a competence and authority that seemed impossible for someone he'd thought of as just a housekeeper. When he finally returned home that evening, he found Ximena in the kitchen, preparing dinner as if nothing had happened. She'd changed out of her wet clothes and back into her uniform, and she was quietly going about her normal duties. "Ximena," Arnold said, his voice different than she'd ever heard it before, less commanding, more uncertain. "I need to talk to you." "Of course, Mr. Wellington." I worked at resort pools and beaches while I was in university. I've performed CPR more times than I can count. You have a doctorate? I am. But then my younger sister Rosa was diagnosed with leukemia. The cost was $300,000, and insurance wouldn't cover it because it was experimental. I gave up my job, my career, everything I'd worked for, and came to North Carolina to work whatever jobs I could find to earn money for Rosa's treatment. She has no idea what it cost me to save her life, and I pray she never finds out. And Miguel needed stability, needed me to be present, not working 80 hours a week in a lab. Finally, he asked, "Where is Miguel now?" I don't want him to carry that burden. Here was a woman with a doctorate degree, someone who could have had a prestigious career, someone who had saved his mother's life without hesitation, and he'd been treating her like she was invisible for 3 years. But what he didn't know yet, what Ximena hadn't told him, was that her story was about to take another incredible turn. Because the next morning, Arnold was going to receive a phone call that would present him with the biggest business crisis of his life. And the only person who could save him would be the woman he'd been paying $15 an hour to clean his toilets. The call came at exactly 7:37 a.m. on Sunday morning, waking Arnold from the first decent night's sleep he'd had in weeks. It was his business partner, David Chen, and David was panicking. "Arnold, we've got a massive problem. The FDA is shutting down the Patterson pharmaceutical deal. They're saying our proposed manufacturing process for the new diabetes medication is inefficient and potentially unsafe. If we can't fix this in the next 72 hours, we're going to lose the contract, and that's $60 million down the drain." The Patterson deal was supposed to be his next big score, a chance to get back into the pharmaceutical technology business in a major way. He'd already invested $12 million of his own money into developing the manufacturing process, and he'd leveraged his reputation to bring in investors for another $48 million. "What exactly are they saying is wrong with the process?" Arnold asked, grabbing a notepad from his nightstand. "Something about the biochemical conversion process being unstable. They're saying our yield rates are too low and the purity levels aren't consistent enough for FDA approval. Arnold, I'll be honest with you. I don't understand half of what they're talking about. This is way above my level of expertise." Arnold's expertise was in software and business development, not biochemical engineering. They'd both been relying on their team of consultants to handle the technical aspects of the deal, but apparently those consultants had missed something crucial. "Who can we call?" Arnold asked, already scrolling through his contacts. "What about Thompson Industries? They have biochemical engineers on staff. Everyone who's qualified is either already working on competing projects or wants more time than we have. Arnold, we need someone who can solve this problem in the next 3 days, or we're finished." All of it was on the line, and he had no idea how to solve a problem that was completely outside his area of expertise. That's when he remembered what Ximena had told him the night before. Biochemical engineering, a PhD from one of Mexico's most prestigious universities, a dissertation on developing more efficient processes for producing pharmaceutical compounds. The woman who had saved his mother's life might be the only person who could save his business. Arnold found Ximena in the laundry room, folding towels with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything she did. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, she could immediately tell that something was wrong. "Mr. Wellington, is everything all right? Is Mrs. Eleanor okay?" "Ximena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. It's still my passion, even if it's not my profession anymore." "You're talking about large-scale pharmaceutical manufacturing," she said when he finished. "Biochemical conversion processes for diabetes medication. I know that compound very well. I actually published a paper on optimizing metformin production during my doctoral studies. Mr. Wellington, may I see the technical specifications for your current process?" She'd been working steadily, occasionally asking Arnold to help her look up specific technical data or call David for additional information about their current setup. Arnold watched in amazement as Ximena worked. This wasn't the quiet, deferential housekeeper he'd known for 3 years. This was a scientist in her element, someone who clearly understood complex problems that were completely over his head. She moved between calculations with confidence, cross-referenced technical specifications with the ease of someone who had done this thousands of times, and identified problems in their manufacturing process that none of their high-paid consultants had caught. "Here's your problem," Ximena said finally, pointing to a complex flowchart she'd drawn. "Your consultants are using a traditional batch process that was developed in the 1990s. It works, but it's inefficient and produces inconsistent results because the reaction conditions aren't precisely controlled. Wellington, implementing this kind of change in 72 hours is going to require some very precise work. What do you need?" Ximena arrived at the Patterson manufacturing facility on Monday morning, wearing a borrowed lab coat and carrying a briefcase full of technical specifications that she'd worked on until 4 a.m. Arnold introduced her to the production team as a consulting biochemical engineer, without mentioning that she was also his housekeeper. The team, desperate for solutions and running out of time, was willing to listen to anyone who might be able to help. What they discovered was that Ximena didn't just understand the theory of pharmaceutical manufacturing. She understood the practical realities of making it work in the real world. She could look at a piece of equipment and immediately diagnose problems that had been causing inconsistent results. She could suggest modifications to reaction temperatures and timing that optimized both yield and purity. She could redesign entire sections of the process flow to eliminate bottlenecks and reduce waste. By Tuesday afternoon, the production team was following Ximena's instructions without question. She had earned their respect not through credentials or titles, but through competence and results. The test batches they were producing using her modified process were showing dramatic improvements in both efficiency and quality. But Tuesday night, when Arnold thought they were finally going to solve the problem, Ximena discovered something that changed everything. "Mr. Wellington," she said, looking up from a stack of financial projections David had brought to the facility, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. 12 million. Wellington, I can save this deal. I can redesign your entire process to not only meet FDA requirements, but to be more profitable than anything your competitors are doing. But I need to tell you something first. I'm not sure I'm ready for that." She stood in front of a room full of government regulators, pharmaceutical executives, and technical experts, and explained exactly how the new continuous flow process would work, why it was superior to existing methods, and how it would ensure both safety and efficiency in large-scale production. The lead FDA inspector, Dr. Patricia Morgan, asked technical questions that would have stumped most consulting engineers. Ximena answered everyone with precision and confidence, often providing more detail than the questions required, and demonstrating a depth of knowledge that impressed even the skeptical regulators. "Dr. Rodriguez," Dr. Morgan said at the end of the presentation, using Ximena's correct title for the first time. "This is some of the most innovative pharmaceutical process engineering I've seen in 15 years with the FDA. Not only does your design meet our requirements, it exceeds them significantly. You've essentially solved problems that the entire industry has been struggling with." This was the moment when everything would come out, when Ximena's secret would be revealed, when the truth about her sacrifice and his blindness would be exposed. Ximena looked at Arnold for a moment, then back at Dr. Morgan. "Dr. Morgan, sometimes we do what we need to do to take care of the people we love. My qualifications are what they are, but my priorities have always been my family. Mr. Wellington gave me the opportunity to use my skills to help solve this problem, and I'm grateful for that chance. The new manufacturing process would eventually become an industry standard, saving pharmaceutical companies millions of dollars and making life-saving medications more affordable for patients around the world. But for Arnold, the real transformation was just beginning. That evening, as they drove back from the manufacturing facility, Arnold tried to find words to express what he was feeling. "Ximena, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my mother's life, you saved my business, you saved my reputation. I owe you everything. I had one of the most brilliant people I've ever met cleaning my house for $15 an hour, and I never even bothered to really see you. Today, when you introduced me to your business partners as Dr. Rodriguez, when you trusted me with your most important problem, when you stood beside me while I presented to the FDA, that was the first time in 20 years that I felt like myself again. I want you to lead our pharmaceutical consulting division. He deserves to know that he comes from a woman who gave up everything to save her sister's life, who came to a foreign country with nothing and built a life through sheer determination and courage. About Rosa's leukemia, about the sacrifice she'd made to pay for treatment, about her education and career in Mexico, about why she'd really come to North Carolina. Miguel listened to the entire story without interrupting, his expression moving from confusion to amazement to something that looked like pride mixed with heartbreak. "Mama," he said when she finished, "you gave up everything for Tia Rosa. I gained you. I gained a life in America. I gained experiences I never would have had. Mama, do you know what I want to be when I graduate?" Ximena Rodriguez started work as the Director of Pharmaceutical Process Innovation at Wellington Technologies, with a starting salary of $250,000 per year, plus equity in the company. Her first project was developing more efficient manufacturing processes for pediatric cancer medications, work that would eventually help make life-saving treatments available to children whose families couldn't afford them. Arnold had his home office converted into a library and study space, and he began volunteering his time and money to help other immigrant professionals get their foreign credentials recognized in the United States. Eleanor, fully recovered from her accident, became Ximena's biggest champion, introducing her to other wealthy families as the most remarkable woman I've ever met. He began actually talking to the people who worked for him, learning their names, understanding their dreams and struggles. He discovered that his landscaper was a former architect from Honduras, that his part-time driver was working on a law degree at night, that his accountant's assistant was supporting 3 younger siblings while putting herself through medical school. Miguel graduated summa cum laude from NC State and was accepted to MIT's graduate program in biomedical engineering. At his graduation ceremony, when they called his name to receive his diploma, he stood up and pointed to the audience where Ximena was sitting. "Everything I am, I owe to my mother," he said into the microphone, even though it wasn't part of the ceremony. "She taught me that education is not about what you can get, but about what you can give." The guest list included FDA regulators, pharmaceutical executives, university researchers, and several of the immigrant professionals whose careers Arnold had helped resurrect through his foundation. As the evening wound down and the last guests were leaving, Arnold found Ximena standing by the pool where everything had started. "Do you ever think about how different everything would be if my mother's wheelchair hadn't rolled toward the water that day?" he asked. "I think about how many people's lives are changed by single moments of choice," Ximena replied. "Your mother needed help, and I chose to help her. You had a problem you couldn't solve, and you chose to trust me to solve it. Miguel needed to know the truth about his family, and I chose to tell him. But after a while, I gave up on that dream. I decided it would never happen. Arnold, for the first time in 20 years, I felt like myself again. I've learned more about leadership, about innovation, about what really matters in business from working with you this past year than I learned in 20 years before that. Now I know that the most valuable thing in the world is recognizing the extraordinary potential in ordinary people. And Ximena, there has never been anything ordinary about you. And that's how a Mexican housekeeper with a hidden doctorate became the co-owner of a multi-million-dollar pharmaceutical technology company. How a lonely millionaire learned that respect and humility are worth more than money. And how a single moment of courage by the side of a swimming pool in Charlotte, North Carolina, changed 2 lives forever, and eventually led to medical breakthroughs that would help save thousands of other lives around the world. The story of Arnold Wellington and Dr. Ximena Rodriguez became legendary in business schools as an example of hidden talent and unconscious bias. But for Arnold and Ximena, it was simpler than that. It was about learning to see people for who they really are instead of who we assume them to be. It was about understanding that courage comes in many forms, that sacrifice often goes unrecognized, and that sometimes the person who can save your life is standing right in front of you, if only you have the wisdom to see them. Miguel Rodriguez graduated from MIT with a master's degree in biomedical engineering and joined his mother's company, where he developed a revolutionary new device for monitoring blood sugar in diabetic children. Rosa, the sister whose life Ximena had saved 20 years earlier, brought her family to North Carolina for the first time to see what her sister had built in America. Eleanor Wellington lived to see her 90th birthday, and she spent her final years telling everyone who would listen about the day. A remarkable woman dove into a swimming pool and saved not just her life, but her son's soul. And Arnold? Arnold learned that the most important business lesson of his life had nothing to do with profit margins or market share. It was about recognizing that every person you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about, carrying dreams you can't imagine, and possessing talents you may never see unless you take the time to really look. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, waiting not for recognition or reward, but simply for someone to see them as they truly are. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to discover that the person we've been ignoring, overlooking, or underestimating is exactly the person we need to save us from our own blindness and lead us towards something better than we ever imagined possible. If you enjoyed this incredible true story of hidden talent, sacrifice, and transformation, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more amazing stories that will restore your faith in the power of human potential. Because everyone has a story and everyone deserves to be seen.